Have you ever wondered what would happen if the greatest mind in the history of psychology willingly walked into the wilderness of madness alone, unarmed, and uncertain, just to see what lives inside the soul? What if one of humanity's most brilliant thinkers chose to turn away from society, from logic, from the safety of consensus reality, not because he had to, but because he needed to? What if he sensed that truth didn't reside only in what is visible and measurable, but also in the strange, terrifying terrain of dreams, symbols, and inner voices? Carl Jung, one of the most profound and enigmatic psychologists of the 20th century, did precisely that. At the peak of his professional life, when his name stood tall beside that of Sigmund Freud, when he was celebrated in the halls of academia and revered in intellectual circles, Jung made a radical, almost unthinkable decision. He walked away, not from psychology, but from the conventional practice of it. He stepped beyond the boundaries of reason, into a realm that most feared to even acknowledge, the depths of the unconscious mind. And he didn't do this in pursuit of accolades or theories. He did it because something deep inside was stirring. Something primal. Something sacred. Something he could no longer ignore. He didn't embark on this inner journey because he had lost his mind. He did it because he feared he had never truly met it. What followed was not a retreat, but a deliberate confrontation, a sacred experiment. For 6 long and haunting years, Jung ventured inward with a relentless curiosity. He surrendered himself to what he later described as a creative illness, a spiritual crisis that tore apart his certainties and exposed him to the raw forces of the psyche. He encountered visions that defied logic, voices that spoke in riddles, and mythic beings that emerged from the shadows of antiquity. Gods from forgotten pantheons, demons dressed in archetypes, and inner figures that guided, taunted, and taught. He did not silence them. He engaged with them. He wrote down their words, drew their forms, argued with them, submitted to them. He allowed the unconscious to speak, not in whispers, but in thunder. And from that descent, part madness, part meditation, emerged a mysterious and magnificent artifact, the Red Book, bound in red leather, and handwritten in a calligraphy that echoed medieval manuscripts. The book was unlike anything the world of psychology had ever seen. It was not a scientific treatise. It was not a diary. It was something else entirely. A tapestry of myth and meaning. A visual symphony of mandalas, surreal landscapes, and esoteric symbols. A record of a man's dialogue with his own soul. Jung filled its pages not only with images, but with mythopoetic narratives, philosophical monologues, cryptic encounters, and revelations that felt both timeless and intensely personal. He didn't create the Red Book for public consumption. In fact, he hid it. He believed it was too sacred, too intimate, perhaps even too dangerous for others to see. For decades, it lay locked away in a Swiss bank vault, almost as if it were a relic, or a sealed portal to another world. Whispers surrounded it. Scholars speculated. Was it the ravings of a genius who had cracked, a spiritual diary, a visionary prophecy? The mystery only deepened as time passed. And then, in 2009, nearly 50 years after Jung's death, the veil was lifted. When the Red Book was finally published, it sent shockwaves through the psychological and spiritual communities. Here, at last, was the lost manuscript, the holy grail of Jungian thought, an unfiltered revelation of his inner world. And what the world saw was astonishing: a map of the soul, drawn not in cold analysis, but in blood, fire, and ink. The Red Book is more than just a psychological document. It is a spiritual odyssey, a bold confrontation with the unknown, a journal of dreams, fears, and sacred truths. It is part mystical scripture, part mythological tale, part philosophical warning. It reveals not only the depths of Jung's mind, but the very architecture of the human psyche. It speaks to the timeless struggle between light and shadow, ego and self, order and chaos. It invites us to ask, what lives inside my soul? What monsters do I avoid? What forgotten gods whisper in my dreams? In this video, we'll go far beyond the surface. We'll explore why Jung undertook this perilous journey, what compelled him to leave the world of scientific certainty and wander the interior wilderness. We'll examine what the Red Book reveals about the unconscious mind, the archetypes that shape us, the symbols that haunt us, the eternal myth that plays out in each human life. And more importantly, we'll look at how this strange and beautiful text still speaks urgently, passionately, and prophetically to the modern soul. Because this isn't just the story of a book. It's the story of a man who dared to stand on the edge of sanity and peer into the abyss, not to fall, but to learn. And when he returned, He came back not with madness, but with wisdom. Not with theories, but with visions. Not with fear, but with fire. So join us, as we follow Carl Jung into the darkness. Let us walk beside him into the inner world, where logic falters, but meaning is born. For those brave enough to listen, the Red Book offers more than answers, it offers transformation. Section 1. The Breakdown Before the Breakthrough. Jung's journey into the Red Book began not with a spark of inspiration, but with a plunge into the abyss. It was not a creative urge that drove him forward, but a collapse in existential unraveling that shook him to his very core. Around the year 1913, just as Europe was beginning to tremble on the brink of war, Jung himself was entering a war of the soul. The rupture with Sigmund Freud, once his mentor and close confidant, had left him emotionally adrift. Their intellectual alliance, once charged with revolutionary energy, had fractured under the weight of conflicting visions of the psyche. Freud saw the unconscious as a repository of repressed desires. Jung suspected it was something far older, far deeper, a spiritual reservoir, rich with meaning. When that connection broke, so too did the last pillar of certainty in Jung's inner world. But this wasn't merely professional disillusionment. It was personal. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was dissolving. He began to sense an inner stirring, mysterious, raw, and ancient. A presence, or perhaps a summons, rising from the depths of his own unconscious. He described it as being gripped by something beyond himself. A power that compelled him inward. Disturbing visions began to haunt him, not fleeting dreams, but profound, prophetic images that seemed to burst through the veil of ordinary consciousness. In one dream, a flood of biblical proportions surged across Europe, swallowing cities, washing away civilization itself. But the water was not pure, it was thick with blood, littered with corpses, a vision soaked in the premonition of collective catastrophe. In another, he beheld a massive tree growing out of a human body, a surreal fusion of nature and man, death and rebirth. Most people would have dismissed such experiences as madness, but Jung leaned in. He believed these visions weren't hallucinations or symptoms to be cured, but messages, symbols from the deeper layers of the psyche. He saw them as ancient voices trying to speak through forgotten images, long buried by the rational mind. In response, Jung withdrew from his professional life. He stopped seeing patients. He severed ties with the external world and turned inward into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. To navigate this inner chaos, Jung pioneered a method he called active imagination, a bold and dangerous practice of entering into dialogue with the figures and symbols that emerged from his psyche. Unlike passive dreaming, this was a conscious descent into the underworld of the mind. He would sit, enter a semi-trance state, and speak to the images that appeared, asking them questions, listening to their answers, and engaging with them, as though they were autonomous beings. He didn't merely observe these inner events, he participated in them. He followed their logic, respected their voice, and allowed their mythic drama to unfold. Over time, he filled over 1,000 pages in his black-covered notebooks, documenting this strange odyssey of the soul. These raw, handwritten journals would eventually be distilled, illustrated, and transcribed into the now famous Red Book, or Liber Novus, the New Book, as he titled it in Latin. To the outside world, it may have looked like madness, but to Jung this was myth-making, not fantasy, but the rediscovery of a sacred inner language, one humanity had lost in its obsession with reason and science. Jung believed that within every human being lies a myth, waiting to be lived, a story, buried deep in the soul, older than our name, more true than our biography. And if we ignore that story, if we pretend it isn't there, the psyche will protest, it will revolt, it will send dreams, symptoms, neuroses, and even breakdowns as wake-up calls. But if we dare to listen, if we dare to embrace that myth, it can lead not to destruction, but to transformation. From the ruins of his crisis, Jung would rise, not as a broken man, but as a visionary who had glimpsed the architecture of the soul. Section 2. Meeting Philemon, the Sage Within. Among the many figures Jung encountered during his descent, one stands out as perhaps the most mysterious and illuminating: Philemon. To Jung, Philemon was not merely a character or an artistic projection. He was a fully formed personality, an autonomous figure who lived within the depths of Jung's unconscious mind. He was depicted as a wise old man with wings like a kingfisher, a long beard, and eyes that held ancient knowledge. Jung didn't invent him. Philemon appeared, and he spoke. In Jung's own words, Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought. This was more than imagination. It was revelation. Philemon became Jung's inner teacher, a symbol of profound wisdom that emerged unbidden from the depths. This encounter marked a turning point. It was here that Jung began to understand what he would later define as archetypes, universal patterns and figures embedded in the collective unconscious. These weren't abstract ideas. They were living forces. They spoke, they moved, they taught. Philemon embodied the archetype of the wise old man, but he wasn't alone. Jung's inner landscape soon filled with a pantheon of symbolic beings. There was Salome, a blind seeress representing intuition, and the feminine unconscious. There was Elijah, the prophet of fire and truth. There were serpents, magicians, warriors, and shadowy tricksters. Each figure challenged Jung, forcing him to confront not only his intellect, but his soul. Every dialogue with these inner beings dismantled his assumptions about reality. Were these entities mere psychological constructs? Or were they expressions of a deeper spiritual dimension, one that modern science had forgotten but the ancients had known? Jung realized that the unconscious was not just a warehouse of repressed thoughts, as Freud believed. It was a realm of meaning, rich with intelligence and structure. A living world governed by its own laws. A place where opposites met, light and shadow, divine and demonic, masculine and feminine. To enter that world was to risk one's sanity, but to avoid it, Jung believed, was even more dangerous. For in that unseen realm lived not only our fears, but also our highest potentials, our unlived lives, our divine spark. And so Jung followed Philemon not as a master follows a god, but as a student follows a mystery. He allowed himself to be led through the shifting terrain of inner symbols, trusting that this dialogue with the unconscious was not a descent into delusion, but an ascent toward wholeness. In the Red Book, Jung was not writing a theory. He was recording an initiation, a spiritual trial, a rebirth. And the message he carried back from that world was clear. To know yourself, you must walk through your own darkness. To find your path, you must meet your inner guide. And to awaken fully, you must truly listen to the voice within. Section 3. Madness, Meaning, and Modernity. The Red Book is often compared to Dante's Inferno, Nietzsche's Thus Spoke, Zarathustra, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and not without reason. Each is a journey into the soul's darkest corridors, a descent into the fires of transformation. But the Red Book is not a philosophical treatise crafted from abstract logic. It is something far more primal, raw, and immediate. It is a living, breathing document, a record of spiritual crisis and psychological rebirth. It is not written about transformation. It is transformation. Carl Jung did not write this book from an ivory tower, safe from the world. He wrote it as he stood at the brink of his own inner abyss. In the wake of his break with Freud, Jung voluntarily entered the realm of the irrational. He stepped away from the clear waters of science and dove headfirst into the chaotic sea of myth, image, and archetype. He did not do this to lose himself in madness, but to retrieve something essential from it. He descends into chaos, into darkness, into doubt, not to be consumed by it, but to wrestle with it, to question it, and ultimately, to find the seed of meaning growing within it. It is not a comfortable journey. It is not safe, but it is necessary. Jung wrote, "The soul demands your folly, not your wisdom." It is a statement that shakes the modern mind. We are taught to admire logic, to pursue control, to fear what is irrational. But Jung reminds us that healing does not always come in the form of insight or clever analysis. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a dream, a symbol, a paradox, a descent. In other words, true transformation comes not from avoiding madness, but from confronting it with honesty and courage. We must enter the places we fear the most not to be destroyed by them, but to be remade. This is what makes the Red Book so radical, even in today's world, especially in today's world. We live in a time obsessed with productivity, image, speed, and certainty. Everything must be optimized, branded, quantified. Ambiguity is seen as weakness. Mystery is ignored. Silence is feared. But Jung invites us into the opposite, into slowness, imagination, and the unknown. He invites us to wander, to get lost, to listen deeply to the inner voices we've silenced. He invites us to stop answering, and to begin asking again. He shows us that losing your way can be the beginning of finding it. That wholeness is not perfection, but integration. That sanity isn't the absence of suffering, but the presence of meaning carved out of the raw material of pain, confusion, and longing. And that healing comes not from running from the abyss, but from standing at its edge, And listening. Listening to the voices that rise from its depths. Listening without judgment. Without fear. Until what once terrified us begins to reveal its wisdom. Madness, when met with courage and care, becomes the gateway to a deeper sanity, sanity rooted not in denial, but in profound self-acceptance. Section 4. The Hidden Legacy of the Red Book. Despite its profound depth and mythic resonance, Jung refused to publish the Red Book in his lifetime. He feared it would damage his scientific reputation, or be dismissed as mere psychosis. And perhaps, on some level, he knew the world wasn't ready. How could it be? This was not just a book, it was a portal into the unconscious. A confrontation with the numinous. A psychological initiation disguised as literature. For decades, it remained locked away in a Swiss vault, guarded like a sacred relic. Few had even seen it. Fewer understood it. And yet, its presence lingered in Jung's public work like a ghost beneath the surface. Only after his death did his heirs finally allow its publication. When they did, it stunned even seasoned Jungians. It was unlike anything anyone expected. Scholars were shocked. Artists were inspired. Therapists found new tools. Spiritual seekers discovered a sacred text. Some call it a gospel of the soul. Others, a psychological Rosetta Stone. And for good reason. Within its crimson pages, lie visions, dialogues, mandalas, dreams, and demons. There are encounters with biblical figures, mythic archetypes, and ancient gods. There are images that defy logic, but speak directly to something ancient within us, something we've forgotten how to hear. It has inspired paintings, poems, films, even video games. But its influence is deeper than mere homage. It stirs the unconscious. It calls forth the imagination. It reawakens the soul. But perhaps its greatest legacy is this. The Red Book is a mirror. And not a mirror of the surface self, the curated identity we show to the world. It is a mirror of the deep self, the inner world we often avoid. When you look into it, you don't just see Jung's journey. You see your own. You see your forgotten dreams, your buried fears, your unspoken longings, your unresolved grief. And perhaps if you are willing to keep looking, the first glimmer of your own transformation. It reminds us that the path to the soul is not linear. It is circular. It spirals. It repeats. It descends before it rises. And in that spiral lies a sacred truth, that our darkest nights often conceal the brightest seeds. Conclusion. Final reflection. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how many of us truly claim that privilege? How many dare to descend into the labyrinth of the psyche to retrieve the parts of ourselves we've exiled? The Red Book is a guide not through facts and logic, but through symbol and soul. It does not offer neat answers. It offers a path through uncertainty, contradiction, and inner mystery. It asks us not to explain life, but to experience it. Not to cure our madness, but to converse with it, to sit beside it, to ask it what it wants. In an age of noise, Jung invites us to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. In a culture of masks, he teaches us to face the self, to look beyond roles and expectations, and ask, who am I, really? And in a world that fears madness, he shows us the wisdom that waits just beyond it. The Red Book is not a relic, it is a living flame. It burns through illusion, it reveals the soul. And if you are brave enough to follow it, it may lead you not just into the depths of Jung's psyche but into the unexplored terrain of your own.